So I just wanted to highlight where Americans generally stand with regard to Ukraine, Russia, Putin, and somewhat China for some context here. Now, this question came out of the Pew Research Center that says Americans overwhelmingly have negative views on Russia and China. Now, if you look, you have two statistics here. You have very unfavorable and somewhat unfavorable. So 91% of Americans that were surveyed have at least a somewhat unfavorable view of Russia, with 62% saying they have a very unfavorable view. Now you look at this, it's 83% for China with the breakdown there. Now when you talk about the leaders of each, Vladimir Putin, do we have confidence that either of these leaders will do the right thing? 90% of Americans think that Vladimir Putin will not do the right thing. I mean, 71% have none at all, with 19% not too much. 77% think the same thing for Xi Jinping. Now, moving on to how we see Russia, whether they're an enemy, a competitor, or a partner. Back in January of 2022, we see that 41% of Americans saw Russia as an enemy, 49% as a competitor. And by competitor, it's mostly not necessarily someone we'd fight a war against, but someone that we compete on the business and international stage for influence, etc., across the globe. Moving to March, right after the invasion, it jumped to 70%, and then it settled down, and it stays around this mark for a significant time since 2023, March 2023. So they break it down by the party of the respondents. Currently, 63%, or at least this year, 63% of Republicans say that Russia is the enemy, and a whopping 96% see them either as a competitor or the enemy. When you look at Democrats, 68% see Russia as the enemy, and 27% at least as a competitor. So still pretty significant, and this totals out again to 64% see Russia as an enemy, 64% of Americans. Now, when using the same polling data, Americans are more likely to see Russia as an enemy of the United States than China. China is just seen more as a competitor on the international stage. So 64% of Americans see Russians as the enemy, 38% see China as the enemy. Again, China is just more of a competitor on the international stage, competing for influence in business. A lot of candidates are talking about how Americans see China as the greater threat. Well, Americans in general see Russia as the enemy more so than they see China. Now, this chart and the next chart come from the Reagan Institute National Defense Survey, and this one talks about support for Ukraine broken down by Republicans and Democrats with the overall. Republicans from November of last year have seen a drop in support from 51% to 49% approve of supporting Ukraine. Democrats have risen from roughly 73% to 75% in that same time frame, in that 1 year time frame. This has brought an average of about 52% to 54% support Ukraine. This is just an American poll, obviously. So 54% overall support Ukraine and support aid for Ukraine. So this poll from the Reagan Institute, where it provides context, I think this poll is the most important of the ones I've shown you, because when we educate people on what this aid is for, using the Reagan doctrine framing, and obviously this poll came out of the Reagan Institute, so they're going to talk about Reagan doctrine framing. But when we use that framing, when we provide context to why we're giving aid, in every case, Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, people start to change their view and say, yes, I agree that we should continue to provide aid. And the Reagan doctrine talks about how the United States has historically provided security assistance to its allies and friends to defend themselves. And when you look at Ukraine specifically, which is what I'm talking about here, there's an 8% jump. An 8% jump. Now we see a 10% jump on Taiwan. And how are we framing this? How are we adding context? Well, a lot of people are just uneducated about how this aid is going about. They think that we're just handing over briefcases full of money to President Zelensky himself and assuming he's going to be using it wisely. But in reality, there is a system here. There are checks and balances. There are monitoring systems in place through the U.S. military, working in Ukraine, in Germany, in Washington. And the stuff we're giving them isn't just money. We're giving them equipment, and then we say that the value of that equipment is then deducted from the total that has been authorized. So when it goes to fighting what, as I showed before, Americans believe is our enemy in Russia, when it goes to fighting them to help Ukraine eject them out of their country, it's going for a good cause. And when we frame it that way and we continue to talk about the aid to Ukraine in that way, you see the opinions change, and there's a more favorable opinion of providing aid to Ukraine. And then finally, I want to talk about this idea that we are taking away from the American public when we provide aid to Ukraine. The naysayers seem to think we're just handing over briefcases full of money, when that couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, military aid for Ukraine has been a huge job creator in the U.S. More than 80% of the investments to Ukrainian aid have never left the U.S. And again, it's because we are not giving over bags and briefcases full of money. We are buying equipment for Ukraine to use against the Russians. Where does that equipment come from? The United States. And the biggest winners are states like Pennsylvania, Texas, Arizona, Wisconsin. And you look at this map, Arizona, Stinger missiles. Texas and Pennsylvania make 155 millimeter artillery rounds. You have javelins coming out of Alabama, Virginia making tracked vehicles, HIMARS coming out of New Jersey, tanks coming out of Michigan, Oshkosh in Wisconsin providing logistics equipment. All of these are benefactors of aid to Ukraine because we aren't sending money to Ukraine. We're buying American equipment from American businesses that employ Americans and then sending it over to Ukraine. And oh, by the way, this also helps some of our core values as Americans in defending freedom and democratic values across the globe to provide for additional stability and security for our friends and allies. So the fact that we are helping the U.S. economy, and I get that the military-industrial complex is a four-letter word, but we have to come to the reality that the United States is the largest military exporter in the world by far. And when we export military equipment and it's shown to be very effective, it's a great advertiser for other countries to buy military equipment. And it's a great showcase for the capabilities of the United States, which provide jobs. And by the way, when France, the United Kingdom, they buy military equipment for Ukraine, often they're buying American equipment on behalf of Ukraine, as well as providing their own. So again, this idea that this aid is hurting Americans is complete nonsense.